All right, so let's get started. I'm sure we'll have some stragglers come in and join us. But thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Jake Aceto. I am the outreach coordinator here at ACT. And tonight we will be joined by two other ACT members, our executive director, Rosalind Page, and our conservation projects manager, Rick Walling. And they're going to present to us how a land trust operates. Just let you guys know a little bit more about the work that not just ACT, but other land trusts and other conservation agencies do and why it's so important. Rosalind has been executive director at ACT for the past year, but has been involved with ACT for the better part of a decade. She was a board member for about 9 years. She also conserved a piece of her property with ACT. Rick Walling has been a staff member at ACT for the past 2 years, but like Rosalind, also served on the board, was on several committees with ACT, and also put a piece of his property into conservation with ACT. So before I turn it over to them for their presentation, I just wanted to go over a couple of things about how the presentation is going to go. So please stay muted throughout. This will just allow Rosalind and Rick to go through their presentation and make sure that everybody can hear them and understand them all right. If you have any questions, we are going to do a Q&A at the end of the presentation, but feel free to, as they come up, put them in the chat box. And then at the end, I will moderate that and read it out, and Rosalind and Rick can get to all your questions at the end. We also will be recording this presentation, and we will be putting it up on ACT's YouTube channel at the end, and we will share that with everybody in case your connection time's out and you miss a section in the middle. Don't worry, we will have the recording for you. So with that, I will hand it over to Rosalind and Rick.
Thank you, Jake. And first of all, thank you to everybody for signing on tonight. We're looking forward to chatting with you about conservation. And this is, Rick and I have done this talk before to conservation commissions, live and in person. We have not done it before on Zoom, so this is a new experience for us. So if we don't get it quite right, please bear with us. But it's fun to put it together. So anyway, the topic of conservation is a huge one, and Rick and I can both talk for quite a long time about it, but rest assured we are not going to do that this evening. We're going to talk for maybe 30-35 minutes, give you a brief overview of what conservation is all about from the land trust perspective, and then hopefully have some questions and answers at the end. So what we've done is we've kind of divided the topic up into 5 main areas, which Rick and I are going to kind of alternate talking about. The first topic is why. Why do we do this work? What's the point of it? The second topic is what type of organizations do this work? The third one is how do we actually get this done? Fourth is what is the long-term responsibility of ACT or any other conservation organization that takes on conserved properties? And the last one is what does this cost? Where does the money come from, and how long does it take? So that's kind of one last final area. So with that said, I am now going to pass it over to Rick, and he's going to give you a little bit of an overview of why do we even do this work in the first place. So over to you, Rick.
Okay, so why protect land with a conservation easement? Well, just the fact that there's a mechanism to do that shows that there's a societal interest in protecting land. And our communities have decided that our natural environment's important, and conserving parts of that natural environment or working environment are, for now and for the future, are important, and for the safety and pleasure of all of us. So, or at least most of it. I suppose there are some people out there that don't like it, but those are other stories. Now, to be eligible in New Hampshire for a conservation easement, the easement must serve a public good. And that doesn't mean that the public have access to run all over somebody's property. In fact, while it is a matter of public record, their conservation easement deeds are recorded in the county courthouse. Most folks might not even know that there is a conservation easement on a particular property. So, but how might a conservation easement on a property serve a public good? And most of the reasons revolve around characteristics of a property, generally referred to as conservation values. And some examples of conservation values might include clean water, protecting water quality, be it surface water or an aquifer, can be a high priority for conservation values. And that might be for drinking water, source protection, for wildlife habitat, or for recreation and viewing. Good habitat for wildlife and plants and trees, etc. It could be the soil types, the terrain, the present condition of a property, or the potential for a property to recover from some previous land use. The property has characteristics that would promote sustainability of plants and animals. So good soils to grow food, kind of self-explanatory, but something to keep in mind is that often soils that are good for growing food are also good for growing houses. Good area for a agricultural field is also a good area for a housing development or a target or whatever. And as the population increases, so does the need for properties to develop. Conservation of high quality agricultural soils is working farms. That's a core value for ACT. Good soils for growing trees, for wildlife, logging, forests, forest management, logging, or forest for wildlife habitat. A well-managed forest landscape is a resource that can provide open land for viewing, for lumber, for wildlife, for recreation, and or any combination of those. And again, a working landscape is a core value for ACT's mission. Good soil for growing trees. Did I already do that one? Yeah, I've done both of those. I've gotten lost already. Connectivity is another conservation value, and that's if a property is adjacent to or near another conserved piece or is part of a wildlife corridor. That can enhance the conservation values of a particular property. And then outdoors, that we can all spend time in. It's important to our physical and mental health. Conserving open spaces is knitted into the fabric of conservation. While conservation easements on private property does not require public access, some property owners want that access. We manage properties that we have easements on, but the landowner was very specific that they wanted trails for the public to enjoy. Some funding sources require public access, but it's up to the landowner what they want to do, what level, if any, they want for public access on their property. It's a little different if it's an ACT fee-owned property. Those are always open for a variety of activities to the public. So, but a conservation value of just an outdoor property, it may be the view of the property from a road, a park, etc. And even if a property is not open to public access, open space can be considered a conservation value. Now, any property that's conserved will have at least some of these basic attributes, and some properties have all of them and even more. So after a landowner contacts ACT, one of the first steps for us is to carry out a preliminary analysis. And Jesse Moore, our staff ecologist and lands manager, he'll look at a variety of data sets and even visit the property and get an idea of what the potential conservation values are for that property. Now, that's a presentation on its own. Maybe we can convince Jess to do that at some point. But conservation values inform how or what type of funding avenue might be best suited for a project. And Rosalind will get into that a little later. And we should point out that a conservation value of a property is different and often independent from the monetary value of a conservation easement or a fee property. And again, more on that later. So, Rosalind?
Thank you. Thank you. And I would just point out, add to that, that the Internal Revenue Code and also the state RSAs for New Hampshire also recognize as part of the conservation work. All of those conservation values are actually listed as part of the IRS section 170, which is what we all work under with conservation, where the IRS has said that those conservation values are valuable for tax deductions. And again, we'll get back into that in the future. And the state RSAs in New Hampshire recognize those same conservation values. So they're all, they're not just great ideas, but they're all codified in the Internal Revenue Code and in the state RSAs. So, so moving on, who does this sort of work? Basically, there's two separate groups of organizations that do it. There's a governmental organizations and the non-government organizations. And all these different organizations can actually conserve land. So the government ones, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, federal government conserves land. And obviously the closest example that we have here is the White Mountain National Forest. The state can conserve land, and in this case, New Hampshire, examples of state parks that have been conserving land are obviously Franconia Notch State Park and Weeks State Park. Then there are regional, or rather local municipalities. Many of the towns in this area have established town forests, which are often run and managed by their conservation commissions. Here in Franconia, there's a town forest. Sugar Hill has some property that keeps as a town forest. There's all conserved land. I believe Littleton has, I'm not sure they have a town forest, but they certainly have conserved lands, and various other towns as well. So those are all the governmental organizations that that can conserve land. The non-governmental organizations are nonprofits, 501c3s, and we operate under that Internal Revenue Code of section 170, which I know you're all going to go home and Google that after this talk is over and learn lots about it. Really fascinating stuff. But anyway, we operate under those guidelines. We have to register as a nonprofit 501c3. And there again, there are different sizes of organizations. There is the national type size organizations, such as the Nature Conservancy. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. On a regional scale in New Hampshire, we have our friends and colleagues at the Society for Protection of New Hampshire Forest. They do land conservation, and then we have your local regional friendly land trust, which is the Ammonoosuc Conservation Trust. And we obviously conserve land. So we operate in this regional area. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about who ACT is. ACT was started in, like most land trusts, by a group of enthusiastic, passionate residents 22 years ago, maybe just over 22 years ago now. A small group of people in the community saw a much loved piece of land under threat of development. It was a 60-acre parcel that was going to be turned into a subdivision. 7 very enthusiastic people, passionate people got together, raised money from themselves through their own capabilities and also from their neighbors and friends, started a nonprofit. They created the Ammonoosuc Conservation Trust and bought the land, were able to buy the land. And that was the first acquisition that ACT made, and that brought ACT into being. And that was started, as said, by seven passionate people in 2000. And I would just like at this point to acknowledge that two of those original founders, Rebecca Brown and her husband, Harry Reed. I'm sure many of you know Rebecca. She was one of the original founders, and I would like to gratefully acknowledge her passion and vision that brought ACT into being with her fellow neighbors. And she worked as the executive director for ACT for almost 20 years, as many of you well know. And I just want to acknowledge that it was all started by that group of people. So it started off with 7 people, 60 acres of land. And now I am pleased to be able to tell you that we now have 34 properties 22 years later, with almost 5,500 acres that we have conserved over those 22, 23 years. It is managed by a board of 11 trustees who are volunteers. We have committees with about another maybe 11 or 12 volunteers working on the committees, and then maybe another 15, 20 people who volunteer their time to go out onto the land and do monitoring and trail management and so on and so forth. And we're really super grateful to all of those people for volunteering their time. We have the equivalent of about 4 full-time employees, 2 actual full-time and 5 of us who are part-time, and we make about 4 full-time employees altogether, and between us all we get the work done. And at this point I would just like to again to acknowledge all of those people, volunteers and the staff. Everybody's super passionate about what we're doing, committed, and it's a great team, and that's how it all works. So just wanted to get that out there. So moving on to our main area of how do we get this done and what properties do we have. No, you can go back to the other slide briefly. Thank you. So just this is very difficult to see on the screen, I'm sure, but this is a map of all of our conserved lands, and some of the colors of green there are other conserved lands, but the ones with the little numbers on them, which are a little difficult to see, it shows that we have land going from, we have conserved land in the Ammonoosuc River watershed, basically from Lancaster in the north down to Piermont in the south. We have quite a large cluster in the Franconia, Sugar Hill, Bethlehem area. As you can see, Monroe, Lyman, Lisbon, Landolph. So that's kind of our service area. So that's, and hopefully that map continues to get more little green squares every year. So, so the next slide would be good. So now we want to move on a little bit as to how do we make this all happen? So basically there are 2 methods by which ACT can conserve land. It can become the forever owner. It can acquire the land and actually take a warranty deed and become the forever owner. That's the first method. And the second method is that ACT will take an easement on a piece of property, which is where the landowner continues to own the property, but ACT holds an easement over it. And the definition of a conservation easement, I'm just going to read it off to you, is a permanent, legally binding agreement between a landowner and a land trust or a government agency that permanently restricts the use of the land to protect its significant natural features. And those significant natural features are actually the conservation values that Rick was talking about a few minutes ago. So in order to put this together, the landowner and ACT sit down and we work together to determine what rights are going to be relinquished by the landowner so that the conservation values can be maintained. Rights to be reserved, for example, might be a timber harvest, might be maple sugaring, recreational trails, agriculture, farm stands, agritourism, cutting wood for their personal use, alternative energy installations for personal power productions. Those are all examples of rights that will be reserved, may be reserved by the landowner. They are going to continue to have those rights, and any of those rights can be maintained as long as they are not inconsistent with the conservation values that we're trying to preserve on this particular property. Rights that they might agree to give up might be the right to build a house in the middle of the conserved property, build a nuclear power station, install a cell tower, rent out the property for camping, run a gravel pit or another mining operation, or run some other kind of commercial thing like a commercial solar farm, something of that nature. So all of these decisions are part of a discussion process, which we go through with the landowner to decide what's going to be given up and what is going to be retained. And this process is quite time consuming. Oftentimes there's a fair amount of back and forth as we decide what's working and what's not working. And I want to stress at this point that this is all a voluntary action. At any point that the landowner decides it's not working for them, they can back out. There's no penalty for deciding that this isn't working. It's a voluntary act between ACT and the landowner. And sometimes the landowner may want to retain certain rights that ACT feels are not consistent with the conservation values, so we may back out. So it's a back and forth. And as I said, it takes a fair amount of time to get there. But it's good when we do. So in order to, so that's for an easement. There are two methods by which ACT actually can acquire, or the landowner can convey the land or the easement. One method is that they can sell the property to ACT for actual money, or they can sell the easement to ACT for actual money and get paid for it. They can decide that they want to donate the land and possibly take a tax deduction on the value of that gift, because they are gifting the land or they are gifting the value of the easement to a nonprofit, which is what we are. And that is permitted by the IRS under that section 170, as long as you've met all the conservation value requirements. The other option, the third option, is that the landowner can decide that they actually want to do something, a little bit of a hybrid, and that they may sell it for 75% of the value and donate the other 25% of the value. And they may be able to take a tax deduction on that 25% that they have donated. And again, this is all something that we work back and forth with during that process. And again, each individual project is unique in that different landowners have different interests and needs and requirements, and we obviously want to honor those. So those are the three different financial components of the project acquisition. All of these, the financial end requires specialized appraisals. It's not just like your normal appraisal that you get when you go to refinance your house or you go to buy a house. It's a specialized appraisal. There are unfortunately not too many appraisers who do this type of work. So that's often extends the time frame that we have in order to get that appraisal done. They're very specialized, they're very complicated appraisals. Sometimes they can extend to be, one appraisal we had to review was 256 pages long. So they can be quite complex, but that is how we determine the monetary value of either the amount that we're going to pay for the easement or the land, or whether we're going to, whether they're going to take a donation. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back to Rick to talk about, if this project comes to fruition, what is ACT's long-term responsibility? And then I will come back and we'll talk about what does this cost, where does the money coming from, and how long does it take? So back over to you, Rick.
Okay, so once the landowner and ACT have decided that everything's going to work out, there's a legal document, a deed, that gets registered at the courthouse. And from there, once ACT takes on that responsibility, we've got a whole suite of things that are attached to that, and it's forever, in perpetuity, I think is the legal term. And we operate under guidelines, in-house guidelines, but we also have to operate under those set out by the Land Trust Alliance, and that's a national organization of land trusts, and we're an accredited member. And sometimes there are state and federal agencies that have their additional requirements, and sometimes funders have additional reporting requirements. So even just getting started is, well, getting started's fun, but not easy. The long-term care of the property or responsibilities of to a conservation easement are complicated, and some of them can be fun too. If it's a fee-owned property, ACT will develop a management plan, and that'll guide us on how the property is used, maybe for logging, maybe for trail management, maybe planting trees, usually some combination of those and other uses. However, the property is to be managed for the conservation values. We're back to that again and again and again. It's the conservation values that drive this whole process. And they're the foremost in the considerations of not only do we take an easement or buy the property, but also how the property is managed through time. For conservation easement on private property, the property owner develops management plans. And again, they're to maintain the conservation values. Now, at a minimum, oops, where did I go? I'm back. I don't know if y'all lost me, but I lost you. So at a minimum, an annual inspection of each property is carried out. It's called a monitoring of the property, and it ensures that the current landowner is honoring the terms of the easement and not building houses or, as Rosalind put it, nuclear power stations, not cutting trees without a management plan, etc. For a fee or eased property, the annual visit also helps ensure that the neighbors aren't encroaching on the property. And a report of the monitoring activities for our files and for certain fundraisers record the conditions of the property through time. So for a property with recreational uses such as trails, there are added maintenance requirements. And mentioned here that monitoring and trail maintenance are activities that ACT volunteers are very involved in. And if there's anybody listening and not involved but wants to, there's always an opening. So now managing the land in perpetuity, it's no small thing. It requires a huge commitment on the part of ACT and the landowner. Remember, it's forever. So, but we even have contingencies that if for some reason ACT were to go away, just vanish, we all got abducted one night by the mothership. There is in the deed, in the conservation deed, there is a backup holder who is designated and who has agreed to take over the responsibilities of managing the easement or the fee property. So I think that's the highlights of it. But the thing to remember, it is forever, and we have specific obligations that we have to uphold on each property.
Great. Thank you, Rick. So the big question is, what does this cost? Where does the money come from, and how long does it take? So more than you think, and it varies, is in terms of what it costs to get a project to the point where it is closed, and we are now moving into that long-term maintenance responsibility component. So some of the things that we have to pay for are we have the appraisals that we talked about before to determine the actual monetary value of the donation or the sale, whichever process we're using, or the bargain sale, which is where that's that hybrid model. There is the cost of, we always require that the property be surveyed and that there be a boundary survey map of the property so that we can see what it is that we are going to be managing. Sometimes there are areas that are going to be excluded from the property, such as the house. If it's a farm, for example, there may be excluded areas around the farmhouse and the barns that are not going to be included in the easement. So those have to show up on the map. So those are, again, specialized type of boundary survey maps. We have a title attorney do a title review because we need to make sure that there are no other rights or legal impediments that would create a problem for the conservation down the road. So for example, there isn't the right of Exxon to come in and drill wells looking for natural gas or oil or anything else on the property. So that's, we have to do that before we get too far into the process. This easement document that we've been talking about has to be written again by a specialized legal attorney who's specializes in that type of work. From the staff end, on ACT staff end, we have to prepare what's called a baseline documentation report, which is shortened to BDR. And that is a document that shows everything about the property as of the date that we either acquire the land or the easement. It talks about what type of soils, it talks about what type of wildlife are on there. It has photographs, it has text, maps. We do due diligence to see whether there are any dumps, whether there are any environmental reports of dumping that's gone on the property. We talk about in the BDR exactly what the conditions are as of the time that we took the property. And again, sometimes these baseline documentation reports can run to 150 pages or so, and they have to be signed on the date of the transfer by both ACT and the landowner, that they acknowledge that this is the condition of the land at the time of the closing. So that's something that staff has to put together. There's obviously our project management costs, and then there's this cost of the long-term maintenance of the property, where, as Rick has pointed out, we are helping manage this property in perpetuity. And so we need to have funds available to pay, pay for our staff time for the next 40, 50, 60, 100 years. We may need to, if we find that there are violations, if somebody does start to build that nuclear power station, we may need to bring legal action against that particular landowner who's done that, and that can be costly. So we have to have some money in there for that. So that's called the long-term legal defense and stewardship fund. So each project we do, we have a dollar number in there that we think we're going to need to effectively manage this property in the long term. So those are all various costs that we have to have taken into consideration. Then, of course, if the landowner would like to be paid for the land or paid for the easement, there is money that has to be raised for that. And as Rick talked about at the beginning, typically we will be applying for grants to fund the actual acquisition of that land or the easement. And we will try and select grant funders who match the conservation value. So for example, if it's going to be a piece of property that has high water quality values, we will try to apply to grant funders who are interested in funding clean water projects. If it's a farm, we are going to be applying to oftentimes we apply to the NRCS. They have an agricultural land easement program, and they will supply grants for purchase of farm land or farm easements. So we need to tailor the grant funding to the conservation values, which goes back to why conservation values are so important. Applying for all of those grants takes much longer than I ever thought it was going to take. It takes a significant amount of time to put together the grant application. And of course, you're always, fingers crossed and holding your breath that you're going to get the grant for the project, or otherwise you'll have to wait for another grant cycle to come around. So those are some of the things that are involved with the actual putting the project together. Other sources of funds are sometimes we will do fundraising capital campaigns. And of course, as you all know, as members of ACT, many of you I know are, We do fundraising from individuals such as yourselves, and we do our two fundraising appeals, one in the spring and one in the fall. Excuse me. And those funds go a long way to giving us the wherewithal to be able to do all these projects. So I would like to acknowledge here, I would like to acknowledge all the members that we have. We have, I think, over 300 people who are considered members of ACT, who donate to us every year. Many of those people have been with us right from the beginning. Everybody's very generous, and we really appreciate it. So I want to make a shout out to all of you for helping do this work, because we could not do it without those ongoing funds that help us do all of this work. So thank you for doing all of that and being so supportive of us throughout the years. How long does this type of work take? It usually takes a minimum of 2 years because of all of the things that have to be done. And we have had projects that have taken 5 years or more to come to fruition. A lot of different variables. Sometimes it's just the fact that there are so few appraisers. We have to wait for the appraisers to have time to do the work. Sometimes there's a lot of complicated title issues that have to be dealt with. And sometimes this grant funding cycle takes a while to go through all the different grant funding cycles and get money for these projects. So that's, excuse me, that's it. We've gone on for just over, I think, 35 minutes or so. So at this point, I would like again to thank you all for being here, and open it up to any questions.
Well, we couldn't have done that good a job.
I thought everyone's asleep.
So I actually have a question for the both of you. I guess what made you want to conserve parts of your property for ACT? What kind of gave you that idea? Because that was before you were both staff members decided to make that decision. So I'm assuming you weren't just doing it for that reason. So yeah, why did you conserve your properties?
Well, the piece of property that myself and my husband Tom conserved, it was the last remaining privately owned parcel of land around Pearl Lake in Lisbon, which is a much beloved water resource for many people, fishing, ice fishing, canoeing, and so on. All the remaining land around the property was around the lake was already owned by the town. This was the last piece. It was considered a building lot, and we thought that would be unfortunate if a house was built there in the future. It would diminish the water quality of the lake and the open recreational use of the area, and that's why we wanted to conserve it, which we did.
So for me and my wife, I knew of conservation easements, but I didn't know about them. And it could be thought of as lucky or unlucky for me. Rebecca Brown and I were standing in the hall at a meeting waiting for our turn to give a presentation, and we got to talking about conservation and easements and stuff. Well, and she said, well, you ought to check out ACT. So I got on the lands committee and then got on the board of trustees and learned what a conservation easement is, what it's for, what it does, and decided that, you know, my wife and I talked about it, and our place had been a farm since before 1805. We're only 1.5 miles out of Woodsville, and it's nice flat land that doesn't flood. It's a perfect place for a target or a subdivision or a trailer park or a nuclear facility. We thought it should be, we thought it should stay a farm. It's got some really good soil, a really good wood lot. So decided to put it into a conservation easement. And to do that, I had to resign from the board. And for my because of my background, I helped fill out some of the paperwork, not anything that would be a conflict. And once that process was finished, and the property was in easement and all that, Rebecca said, well, now you know how to do all the paperwork. Why don't you come work for us? So I did.
Great. Yeah, thank you guys. And if anybody else has any questions, just remember, just type them into the chat box, and make sure it says send to everyone, and we will get to you. So Catherine is asking, what is the minimum amount of land that can be conserved?
The smallest amount of acreage we've conserved is an acre. And the largest, I think, is over 1,000 acres. So there really is no minimum. It's really more about the conservation. If there are sufficiently rigorous or strong conservation values on the property, it doesn't really matter what the size is. And I think there was somebody who had her hand up, a Cookie.
Yeah, Cookie.
Yes.
Yeah. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, I can unmute you. There you go.
Can I say it instead of type it?
Yes.
Thank you. This was an awesome presentation. So Rick and Rosalind, thank you very much. It's nice to meet you and see you. I just had kind of curiosity questions. One is, I was just curious who the backup holders, the backup holder of act, are they people? Are they entities? Are they specific to each easement? That's number one. And then the second question, I'm just curious, do you use like one law firm, or where the attorney's located that put your legal work together?
Do you want me to take the first part,
Sure,
Rosalind?
go ahead. Go
Okay.
ahead.
It depends on the conservation values, who the backup holder might be. If it's a property with some good forest on it, the New England Forestry Foundation might be the backup holder. A town conservation commission might be a backup holder. Another land trust might be a backup holder. So it is an entity. It would have to be somebody that was qualified to hold and maintain an easement or a fee property. So yeah, it can't just be an individual. It has to be a nonprofit or a governmental or semi-governmental entity. Did that answer that? Okay.
Great. And so in terms of your question about what professionals do we use, we do have a tendency to use the same professionals, legal professionals, time over time. They, especially with drafting the easement, that is a very specialized type of legal work. So we do work with a young man who, well, I don't know whether he's young or not, but he looks young compared to me, who specializes in doing conservation easement work in Maine and New Hampshire. And he works with us on that. For our title work and closing work, title review, we use local attorneys who are familiar with the ins and outs and the intricacies and the backstories and so on of title work in this area, because they are the most familiar with it. So we use, and we will, we may use one or two different attorneys, again, depending upon timing and who's available.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Again, feel free to type them in the chat box or raise your hand. We can unmute you.
We've explained everything.
You know, you two are just so thorough.
We're good.
Everybody just knows everything about easements now. So, well, if anybody has any other questions, we'll be sending out an email to everybody registered later this week, or early next, most likely, where I'll provide my contact information, Rosalind's contact information, Rick's contact information. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions about ACT, about conservation as a whole, about easements, or anything that you heard today. That email should also have a recording of this presentation. So I know a couple people joined later. So if you missed a portion in the beginning, don't worry. We'll be able to get that to you, and that'll just have a link to it on YouTube. So it'll stay up there, just like our easements forever. So if anybody's interested, our next speaker series is going to be, or speaker series installment rather, is going to be Thursday, March 17th. And we will have Dr. Pamela Hunt joining us from New Hampshire Audubon to give her presentation about the state of New Hampshire birds. So you can check out our website, our events page, to a registration link for that. And we always have other events going on. We're looking to get outside a couple times a month. So keep checking our events page for anything that might interest you. So thank you all again for coming, and we hope to see you outside, see you on the trails, and maybe see you at our next presentation. Everybody have a good one.
Thank you.
Bye.